Welcome to Unit 3, Translation Problems and the Translation Process. Students will be able to first understand the basic stages of the translation process, second, identify and classify translation problems according to our functional hierarchy, and third, develop awareness of the benefits of conceptualizing translation as a problem-solving activity in their learning. Consider this quote. Translation may very probably be the most complex type of event yet produced in the evolution of the cosmos. Do you agree with Richard's assessment? Yes? No? Why? Stop the recording and consider this question. What do you think? Let's look at the translation process, which is one of the areas that may support an idea that translation is an extremely complex cognitive activity. First, we need to start with James S. Holmes, as many introductions to translation studies and the study of translation do. James Holmes himself, practicing translator and an expert in comparative literature, who, although American-born, lived in the Netherlands, authored a very extremely influential lecture, originally given in 1972, which has also obviously undergone various reprints in 1988 and most notably in 1995, where his model and proposals were reworked or used as the basis for Gideon Toury's famous approach to descriptive translation studies, one of, if not the most widely cited translation scholarly work. James S. Holmes, in this lecture entitled "The Name and Nature of Translation Studies," laid the foundations for what he at the time envisioned as the future or independent, autonomous discipline, academic discipline, focusing on the study of translation-related phenomena. He established or delineated the branches of this potentially new academic, at the time, academic discipline, and he charted the territory of this discipline. Many works on translation theory and translation or studying translation have taken James S. Holmes' branches or organization of the translation studies as the basis or point of departure. It has also, obviously, since the 70s and 80s, undergone revisions as well as criticism. James S. Holmes, in this 1972 lecture, referred to translation studies, the name being, for starters, a contentious point. How should we call this new discipline dealing with translation? He chose the name translation studies, and he established the main branches of this independent academic discipline, being the first one being pure, which in turn had theoretical and descriptive sub-branches, and then we had the applied, or he identified the applied branch, as you can see in this depiction, taken from Basil Hatim and Jeremy Monday's 2004 textbook on translation studies. We have in the pure branch, we had the theoretical on the one hand, and then we have the descriptive branch on the other. As you can see, hanging from the descriptive branch, we have the product-oriented, process-oriented, and function-oriented translation studies. We will focus on process-oriented translation studies in this brief first part of Unit 3. Descriptive translation studies will focus on, according to Holmes, on a more empirical, rubber on the ground, so to speak, area of translation studies. focusing on the actual study of translations, product-oriented translation studies, and describing translation in its environment, as opposed to a more theoretical side of this translation studies discipline. We look or focus or restrict our scopus to the product-oriented and process-oriented branches. We can see that product-oriented branches of descriptive translation studies, according to Holmes in 1972, would concentrate on studying existing translations, individual translations. The focus here is textual. As you can see, the product-oriented focuses on the product of the translation process, mainly texts, but not only on translations as such or target texts, but there will be also a focus on comparative analysis, that is taking different or various translations from the same canonical work, like for instance many translations of the Bible or different translations of the Quixote, and these will be compared in turn to their originals to find interesting areas or conclusions of study. Also, in addition to focusing on different or to looking at different versions of canonical texts or different translations of the same text, we will also be looking in this product-oriented DTS branch or the Descriptive Translation Studies branch. Also, we'll be looking at specific pairs of source text and their translations. So this will be the product-oriented translation studies or branch of descriptive translation studies as envisioned by James Holmes. When it comes to process-oriented descriptive translation studies, Holmes foresaw or anticipated that the focus of this branch would be the act of translation itself that would culminate or produce as a result the product, the target text, or translations or translated texts as such. In this case, we're looking at the act, the action of translation, the process of translation. These several interesting areas of research have taken their point of departure from this process-oriented branch or sub-branch of translation studies. One of them is the study of the cognitive dimension of translation, what has been called the black box, the mysterious goings on or processes that take place in the translator's mind when he or she undertakes a translation project. For others, this black box is not as black or as mysterious as imaging and more scientific or empirical studies have taken place in the last decade, which have attempted to complement more qualitative studies of what goes on as far as the cognitive or mental aspects of translation go with neuroimaging and with the actual locating or the attempt of locating the activity of the act of translation in the brain as such. This deals with what's happening in the mind of the goal is to try to elucidate what happens in the mind of the translator in the process of textual comprehension of a text written in a certain language and which derives or results in the production of a new text in another language. As we can imagine, quite a complex process in itself. So, just to quote Saldana and O'Brien in one of the in their useful manual on research methodologies, they look at translation process or process-oriented translation research, and they describe it in this way, and I quote: translation process research seeks to understand translator or interpreter behavior, competence, expertise, the cognitive processes that orient these, and the relations between cognition and the translated or interpreted product. Furthermore, since translation is not divorced from social context, process research seeks to understand the effects of the context on the process. So, in this quote, in this first half of the quote, they encapsulate some of the focus areas of process-oriented translation research. I would invite you to pause the video and make a list of the key areas of research or focus of this process-oriented research as listed in this quote. The second half of the quote, Saldaña and O'Brien continue. Individuals with the specific traits and ways of processing are also a central focus. Hence, while translation process research is frequently understood to mean investigating the mental operations involved in translating, in fact, it encompasses a much broader object of interest. So as you can see, we see the focus of process-oriented research go from what the cognitive aspects of it, what goes on in the mind and brain, or mind or brain, depending on basic theoretical assumptions, or the translator when translating. They also focus on the individual translating, the agent, the human agent doing the translation, and they also look at contexts where translation takes place. So we have a social component or contextual component as well. More recent research, more neuro-based or more scientifically or neuroscience-based research has attempted to focus on brain activity and neurocognition in translation, departing a little bit from this contextualization of the process of translation. Another area of cognitive research in process-based translation studies or translation studies research is what has been termed 4EA cognition. And I quote here from the same manual when it says, recently, however, a new trend has emerged in cognitive translation and interpreting studies advocating in favor of 4EA cognition, to wit, or namely, a view which considers human cognition and indirectly the act of translation and interpreting to be embedded, extended, embodied, enacted, and affective. In fact, this quote comes from Muñoz Martín's recent book on neurocognition and translation and interpretation. So this, as we can see in the Timotsko's 2012 article published in Target, International Journal of Translation, she referred to cognition and neuroscience in translation with a pessimistic view of known unknown, since the mysterious workings of the brain in translation were still inaccessible for some skeptics, whereas Garcia, for his part, refers to the need to add neuroscience-based cognitive work to the non-neural cognitive work. This is his own term, based on what he says or refers to as linguistic and behavioral results, which are obtained through rationalist, observational, introspective, corpus-based, and quantitative approaches. So, traditionally, to sum up, the investigation or the inquiry into the cognitive aspects of translation takes two main roads. One of them has to do with studying what translators do in an introspective and empirical way through the use of certain techniques of investigation and analysis, like eye tracking software, or interviews during and after the process of translation, or translation journals, where translators try to write down or reproduce or record the thought process during translation. And then we have another avenue represented by Garcia, mainly in this case, which tries to locate or look at the application of neuroscience and neuroimaging to actually locate the translation activity in the brain in a more science-based or imaging-based or experimental research. So those will be the two main views of this fascinating and relatively recent um, flourishing area of transition studies in itself, which for some has become a separate subcategory of or subdiscipline within transition studies, um, um, as opposed to or moving away from the original Holmes map. So that would be the aim for the second branch, the idea of mapping or locating translation in brain and neural activity. The Garcia and those who follow this more brain or neuroscience-based approach to cognition and translation try to move away from a situated view of cognition, which is based on, and I quote, contextual factors surrounding cognitive aspects related to the act of translating and interpreting. So not so much the context of what happens in the translation process, but looking at the brain activity as in itself is what they aim at. Let's just look, just after providing some basic groundwork, let's just have a look at a more simplified stage or phase-based description of the transition process by stages and more or less related to the industry and to what translators do in the industry and as trainees as well. There are many models, so for simplification's sake, I've just chosen 3 of them. The main one, the first one, as you can see here, is taken from Daniel Wadek, who studied from a more whose scholarly output, linked the practitioners and industry side with the research and academic side as well, and I think that bridging of both worlds is really useful. As you can see here, starting from your left, we have several phases in his process or detailed process of translation. Starting with acquisition. This acquisition obviously is the point of interface or contact between whoever needs a translation and the agents or individuals who are going to provide this translation. This acquisition will include the specifications or the estimate in which certain more mundane or logistic aspects are agreed upon, like for instance the deadline, the amount of workload, the units that are going to be taken into account to bill and to provide an estimate or a pricing for transition services. And then if we move on from left to right, we will have the pre-transfer phase, in which Wadek identifies quality control and index of anomalies as an identification of potential and anticipation of potential problems. Then hanging from that quality control index of anomalies, you also see 3 additional phases in which we find comprehension. Obviously, we need to understand the message in the source text, followed by a documentary index of questions in which we catalog potential problems in that translation, in that source text, and then we proceed to document or to find sources that would be useful for us in order to find information useful to solve those problems that we have indexed. If you look at the middle yellow documentary index and questions, you see terminological index, the phraseologic index as well. So we look at different units or WADEC is looking at different units of processing. On the one hand, we have terminological units. A term is not the same thing as a word necessarily. A term could be, for instance, made of several words, like rate of unemployment or unemployment rate. That would be a term, a full unit of meaning, specialized meaning. Then we have typical phrases that we may use in translating certain texts, and then we look at the top bottom or the bottom yellow box index for optionables and non-standard items, in which we would establish some sort of catalog of additional components to bear in mind in this translation. If you look at the documentation side, there will be an analysis of the product. We will look at the terminology and the phraseology that we have indexed, and we will look at the different options for the translation of those non-standard items, and then we'll have validations. As a footnote, I think it's, when possible, it's useful to validate these items, a glossary of terms, etc., with the customer beforehand, so that we can have the go ahead or the green light to prevent problems later on. And then finally, as you can see in the light blue, we have the second phase of pre-transfer for WADEC, which he names disassembly and scanning. The transfer phase then will take place, in which obviously we have that moment of transferring, conveying the information that we have in the source text to create a target text. And then we have in WADEC's model the post-transfer phase. In this post-transfer phase we have the checks, we have the auto controls, we have reviews and corrections. As you can see, these all have to do with quality assessment or quality management. Revision and rewriting, which can be linguistic for style, grammatical errors, spelling, punctuation, etc. Or it can be technical, to make sure that the technical aspects are trustworthy, that there are no errors when it comes to the translation of terminology, and that the concepts have been correctly selected, and the correct equivalents have been also chosen in the translation. Then we finally have the certification and reassembly. As you can see, it's really industrial in its dissection of every single step of the translation process. And then finally, delivery to the customer and follow-up for quality or customer satisfaction. So you can see this is a very industrial, as I say, a way of looking at translation, and we will find this type of these steps and this breakup or breakdown in different steps in the actual industry. Providers of translation services, language service providers, companies, as well as freelancers would follow processes similar to these to ensure quality throughout the process from acquisition to delivery. So this is one of the models, Daniel WADEX. If we look at a perhaps more simplified process of translation, I have taken a didactic one from Mariana Orozco, in which this is taken from a manual originally written in Spanish for translation from English into Spanish. And Mariana Orozco, in this case, identifies as the first step the encargo de traducción, or the translation commission. In this case, we may have a customer, which becomes the initiator or the sender of the translation, and crucially, we would have to at least have an idea of the use, the end use, or the purpose of the translation, the target text in this case. Then we have, obviously, sometimes we don't deal with the customer, or translators might not deal with the direct customer, and there might be intermediaries in the process, like translation agencies and so on. The translator receives this commission, And ideally, an analysis of the source text would be undertaken by the translator in this case. In this analysis, according to Orozco, the translator will be looking for main and secondary ideas in the text. He or she will be looking at identifying the production situation or setting of the source text, what the aims of the author and where when producing the source text, the expectations laid on the reader of the source text in the source language, the place and moment of publication. As you can see, there are some components that are in Orozco's model of analysis that match Christiane Nord's model that we've been using for our translation assignments. And we will also be looking at more linguistic aspects like the textual genre, the register, formal, informal, etc., the coherence and cohesion structures, what holds the text together and makes it work, the structure of the text. We would anticipate in this phase potential translation problems as we analyze the source text. We can preview these problems. It's really close to as I say, we're using Christiane Nord's model for our analysis of source texts, and Orozco's model is really close to that. Then Orozco adds the next stage would be sort of the preparation for the translation process as such, what she calls documentación, and then the resolution of problems, or the finding solutions for translation problems. In this documentation and problem resolution phase, translators could be dealing with the sources of documentation, like dictionaries, both online or hard copies, encyclopedias, databases, books, monographs on the subject matter, textbooks, parallel texts that have been written on the same topic as the topic of the source text, but in the target language. Like for instance, our first translation. If I'm going to be translating a recipe into Spanish from English, I might look for recipes in Spanish so I can get a feel for the phraseology and perhaps even find terminological sources, equivalents to certain terms in the source text. I can certainly find the type, the style, the feel, the tone of these types of texts by looking at parallel texts in the same topic. So all these would help us, or it would be the translation proper of finding the use of sources to solve the translation problems that we find. This will, to follow with Orozco's model, this will result hopefully in a first draft of the texto meta, TM, the target text, and then we'll come with a definitive or final version of the target of this target text, and finally a revision or a self-check or a quality check of the translation. So this is another proposal for the translation process and the different stages of the translation process by Orozco. I like to add another one that I think has been mentioned previously, and this is taken from Anthony Pym's proposal for a three-step macro process. In this case, what he is doing in this book in 2010, Exploring Translation Theories, he argues that translators are always theorizing. This is relevant because between practitioners and theorists, especially in translation, there seems to be a chasm or a gap that needs to be bridged, in the sense that practitioners tend to look at with suspicion upon theory, because they claim, well, translation theory is not really useful to help me solve translation problems and get paid, and if you want me to apply translation theory, some skeptics would say, come up with theories that are useful and applicable. And then on the other hand, we have theorists, those who work in the ivory tower, those who look at translation from a theoretical standpoint and try to come up with theories of translation that say, well, theorizing translation is interesting in itself. And who says that we are here to serve the interests of practitioners? There have been some interesting literature published on this subject. But here Pym argues that translators are always theorizing, because their choices they make and how they approach translation projects underlie a theory, a view of translation. So here he suggested three main steps in the translation process. The first one being problem identification. So translation is certainly, I can add to that we can look at translation as a problem-solving activity, and we can look at the result, at the product of the translation process, a translation or any target text, as the potential set of solutions provided by a translator to a certain set of matching problems. So we can look at a source text or a translation task as a list of problems that we need to solve. We need to identify those problems, and as we will see later on, this is not as clear-cut a category as one may think, because for some translators, some components of the source text may be a problem, and others might not see the same problems as such. So sometimes there may be some subjectivity as to what translation problems are. We will look at that later on in the second part of this video lecture. But suffice it to say that for Anthony Pym, the first phase, or the first stage of the translation process is for us to identify the problems that need to be solved. The second will be generation of alternatives. So once we have identified a problem, translators will hopefully come up with a series of alternatives, potential solutions to that problem. This range of solutions or potential problems must be subjected to a selection phase, which is the third phase. And not only the range of selected problems, in addition to the selection, the final decision, there is a view of translation that underlies that and hopefully informs that. So that would be the third component. We need to choose one solution within that range of potential solutions to the problem we have identified. So in here I add that, well, this is a very interesting way of looking at translation problem solving. If you think about it, these three phases of the translation process identified by Pym can actually be applied to any problem-solving situation. You need to identify the problem you have. You need to look at different options, different alternative solutions that you have available to you, and then finally you have to select one and choose one solution out of those that range of potential solutions. If two translators were faced with the same translation, with no commission, no instructions, no specifications, this is a translation, just go ahead and do the work, translate this text into Spanish. Who is to say that they would not come up with a different way of looking at each one of these three phases? Which problems would they identify? Would they be the same? Which alternative solutions would they come up with in the generation phase? Would they be the same? And finally, would they choose the same one? We see this mismatch of reverse engineering in the translation process when a reviser has to revise or proofread someone else's translation. Sometimes errors are found or identified because there's a mismatch between the approach by the translator and then by the reviewer to the execution of these three phases: identification of problems, generation of solutions, and choice or selection of one of them. Now this is where I would say that the translation brief and the Scopus and the source text analysis come in handy, because they will hopefully inform the translator, provide a framework for navigating with certain coherence and certain objectivity this translation problem ID generation and selection process, you see. So if we also add this framework, Scopus, of the intended purpose of the translation brief with all this information useful regarding the translation commission, what we are to do in order to create a translation, and then finally the source text analysis. I suppose it is obvious that if the translator and the reviser or the proofreaders shared the same Scopus translation brief and source text analysis, the revision would be much easier. It would be streamlined, and many going back and forth between the translator and the reviser would be spared, because there would be a common framework to inform a process that otherwise might be different depending on the translator, even if the source text is the same, you see. So I think we need something extra, an additional framework for this very simple three-stage process of translation, and even for the previous two models. Well, so now that we've seen a couple of, in this case, three ways of looking at the transition process and the different stages in this transition process, as I say, by no means comprehensive. I've selected three from Wadek's more complex, Daniel Wadek's more complex model, to Orozco's more simplified process of translation model, to Anthony Pym's extremely simplified model with the three stages. Let's look at translation as a problem-solving activity, which is. So if I can start with two quotes and a couple of contextual slides, I think they will provide an interesting or useful introduction to this idea of translation as a problem-solving activity. As pointed out by Hurtado Albir in 2017, almost 20 years ago, Vils pointed out that there is no uniform concept of necessaries for what constitutes a translation problem, nor any appropriate reliable conceptual framework. Lercher, for his part, draws attention, Hurtado Albir continues, to the fact that the debate over translation problems has been largely speculative and that little in the way of empirical study has been carried out. So it is not as clear-cut. We don't have a clearly agreed upon definition of what transition problem, or a universal definition of what constitutes a transition problem, and there has been very few studies with an empirical nature regarding this notion of transition problem. So Hurtado Albir concludes, the fact remains that despite its importance for transition studies, it is eminently a central notion in transition studies, that of transition problems or transition problem. We still don't have a definition of transition problems which is generally accepted, or a classification of transition problems that has been validated empirically. So, notwithstanding these drawbacks, these problems and this weakness in the model, we need to come up with something that might be useful. Mayoral Asensio, his useful in a useful article reprinted in 2007, mentioned the concept of translation problem, again to underline the idea that it is not well defined. Probably, Mayoral Asensio continues, because problems are subjective perceptions and not objective facts. So what is a problem for one translator is not for another. And what is a problem for a translator at one point in time is not one only a few days later. So what constitutes a problem for you may not be a problem tomorrow, after 2 or 3 translations later. Or what constitutes a problem for a certain translator might not be such for an individual. So the subjectivity of the notion of problem constitutes a problem here when it comes to arriving at a universally accepted definition of transition problem. There's also the component of strategies, the notion of strategies, and in this case we're linking strategies to problem solutions. We will talk a little bit more about transition strategies in Unit 4, but suffice it to say here, and I'm following Chesterman, that there are, Andrew Chesterman, his Memes of Translation book that has been mentioned in the prolegomena or the preliminary study components of the course. Basically, we're looking at communication, right? We were talking, remember, in the introduction, the prolegomena to translation, we were talking about the communication as a main feature of translation. So we are looking at ways of communicating, and obviously we have problems of communication that we need to solve with certain strategies for problem solving. And these problem solving strategies, and we are just in this case previewing some of the contents of Unit 4, but we need to find strategies to solve communication-based problems, because as you can see, many of the problems in translation lead back to problems of communication, a communication breakdown that we need to bridge. We need to solve a problem, and enhance communication between parties. Strategies that solve problems can be reductive, or can also aim at achieving. Reduction strategies have to do with changing or reducing the message in some way, such as avoiding a topic. A clear way of dealing with a problem would be to eliminate it. We avoid it, right? So an example could be the expression of the type of degrees that are used as a measure of heat in an appliance, say for instance an oven, in a recipe. If the recipe originally written in English includes degrees Fahrenheit, and we're not sure whether we need to use Celsius or Fahrenheit, a way of dealing with this could be a reduction, that is, to talk about degrees and forget about Fahrenheit or Celsius. This could be understood as a problem or a translation. It is certainly a problem, what to do with a measurement or a unit of measure. But what about the solution? One of them could be avoidance, elimination of the problem. It might be construed as a translation error later on compared to some sort of framework. Okay, so we are just looking at strategies generally speaking. We are not assessing if they are right or wrong. A reduction strategy in a certain translation project can be certainly acceptable. It might not be so in another. So we need, as I say, we need an additional framework to compare our solutions to see if they come short or if they actually fulfill certain expectations. And in order to do that, we need to have those expectations. But let's not rush to the next sections before we finish with this slide in this case, because we need to look at achievement strategies. This would attempt to preserve the message but change the means to transfer the message, such as, for instance, the use of paraphrases, approximation, restructuring, mime, etc. So the idea in this case would be to achieve some sort of preservation of the message by looking at using different means to achieve this. And this, as you can imagine, translators are always moving between A and B, reduction or achievement. Good. So Chesterman points out, translators are, after all, people who specialize in solving particular kinds of communication problems. So we are specialists in communication and in solving communication problems, according to Chesterman. And translator trainees are interested in learning how to become good translators. In both cases, there are kinds of problems to be solved. So we have these problems lead back to communication. So when it comes to strategies for solving problems, and in this case, again, I emphasize we're looking at we're previewing general concepts having to do with translation problems and solutions. Chesterman provides this, or comes up with, or suggests strategic levels. His main levels have to do with global strategies or local strategies. So he says, and I quote, It therefore seems helpful to distinguish between two levels of strategy. Um, Following these authors, at the more general level, where the problem to be solved is something like, quote, how to translate this text of this or this kind of text, as you can see, a more macro problem. What do we do with contracts? Or what do we do with this whole text? How are we going to approach this text, generally speaking? We have global strategies. See, so global strategies have to do with a macro approach to a certain translation. How am I going to translate this text overall? So examples of global strategies provided by Chesterman could be, for instance, the translator's initial decision about the general nature of the appropriate relation between target and source text. So there's an underlying view, again, theory, you see, an underlying view of equivalence. What's the relationship between the original recipe and the translation in this case? Am I going to translate it freely? What's going to be the type of resemblance, the degrees of equivalence between both? What am I going to be prioritizing in my translation? Another example could be the general issue of dialectical or dialect choice. How am I going to represent source text dialects in my target language? And this happens, as you can imagine, this happens in movies, for instance, or in novels. We need to look at the overall movie, the overall audiovisual product, and see what are we going to do when it comes to dialect. So if I've got a movie where, for instance, we have people from characters or from the southern United States with a certain accent, how am I going to use? What am I going to do when I translate the screenplay for a dubbing or subtitling exercise later on, especially dubbing? Into Spanish? Am I going to just forget about the accent? Am I going to change the dialect and replace it with another dialect in the target text? So that's an interesting strategic, a global strategic concern. An example of this could be that comes to mind would be the Disney classic. El Libro de la Selva, or the Jungle Book. If you have seen that film, I'm referring to the animated feature. There are three vultures towards the end of the film. Mowgli, the protagonist, the youngling who was left in the jungle and was reared by wolves, a pack of wolves, and he is taken back by a panther, Bagheera. He takes the kid back to the human village, and Mowgli finds or meets three vultures, and those three vultures, they originally, if you are into Disney, you will remember that this is Disney history, so just for history buffs, that they initially thought of making those vultures being having the voices acted by the Beatles, so they would have a British accent from the north of England. So in this case, they didn't end up doing this. So, but if you notice the haircuts that they have, maybe one of them or two of the vultures, they still remind us a little bit of the Beatles haircut style or looks. So if you watch the film in the original English soundtrack, you will see that there's a British, that these three vultures have distinctly British sounding accents. And the interesting thing is that if you change to the Spanish version of the movie, you will see that whoever did the translation of the dubbing and then the dubbing with the new actors speaking in Spanish decided quite cleverly, quite smart, smart decision in my view. Each one of the three vultures has a distinctive, speaks in different Spanish variety. So there's one that speaks with a Mexican accent, if I remember correctly. Another one of the vultures speaks with a Argentinian accent, and the third vulture speaks with a quite contrived southern accent or peninsular accent, so Andalusian sort of accent. So it's quite an interesting choice. This is a choice of dialect. How are you going to approach interesting or marked dialectic segments in the source text? And thirdly, another Chesterman continues with these global strategies. Another global strategy might concern decisions about whether an older source text should be modernized or historicized in translation. So if I'm translating the Quixote, should I be using the same style or an equivalent style of English at the time, or should I modernize the language in the target text? So all these have to do. These are decisions that have to do with problems that are global in nature. They are macro-textual. They deal with the whole unit of the movie, the novel, etc., or the whole text. By contrast, local strategies have to do with more specific levels, more different or more specific and discrete situations. So at the more specific level, on the other hand, I'm quoting Chesterman again, the problem to be solved is something like how to translate this structure, how to translate this idea, this item. Here we have local strategies. So just to mention examples that we know, what do we do with the degrees here in this recipe? Should I use Celsius or should I use Fahrenheit? How do I deal with the ways or the formulae to address the reader? Should I use the formal usted? Should I use the tú? Should I use imperative verbal forms of the imperative, or should I use instructions in the infinitive, like freír, cocinar, cocer, or cueza, fría, hornee? These are decisions that have to do with specific items within a text. So they are local problems and they require local strategies, perhaps. So if we one way of looking at problem solving in translation could be what has been discussed and used by different authors with different meanings. The minimax principle. Minimax principle is learn the default, simplest solution to a problem. This minimax principle is quoted, and I'm quoting it from Roberto Mayor Asensio's 2007 article on translation as a problem-solving activity. So this could be a principle that has to do with use the simplest solution to solve a problem, a standard solution. And if this solution does not work, then try something more reflective. This is what translators do all the time, and what we do all the time. We tend to intuitively, instinctively apply basic solutions to problems, and unless we see that these don't work, we don't sit down to plan and carefully work out new, more detailed solutions or comprehensive solutions or more sophisticated solutions. So reflective solutions will be, or more complex solutions will be implemented if the default or simple solution to the problem does not work. That's the minimax principle. So generally, for instance, we would try a word-for-word approach or macro approach for translating problems, and if this doesn't work, then we would look for other options. You see? So, but again, this minimax principle lacks, in my view, a framework of reference. What framework of reference do I have to apply? I mean, does it work? Why? The basic standard solution works. Why? Because of purist views of language. This is not proper Spanish, the target language, or I find it that it sounds right, just about right. I feel is right. What is my client says so. Are there any specs, specifications that I need to fulfill? So again, we need something else. We need a set of specifications so that we can judge if the minimax principle is working. We need a standard to measure our solutions against. But I think it's interesting to use that to bear in mind, to remember that minimax principle, which could be a strategy that we are actually following all the time. We try to translate word for word, and if it doesn't work, well, who says it doesn't work? we would go for other options, you see. But this this proposal of the minimax principle is not bearing in mind any functional approach. Nothing about a transition brief or scopus, which I think is easy to add to that. So that's what we're going to do in the next few slides. We're going to be looking at Christiane Nord's proposal of a functional hierarchy of translation problems, so that we can have something extra that we can add to our identification, generation, and solution process of translation. So this is what I was talking about. I was echoing Nord's quote here when she says that by comparing a scopus, this scopus, with the source text functions before starting to translate, translators should be able to locate the problems that will arise in the translation process. They should thus be able to devise a holistic strategy for their solution. So as you can see, and I agree with this, I concur, that having a scopus for your translation is not only useful during translation, it is also useful to bear that in mind when we are looking at the source text. We look at the source text and the function that it was meant to fulfill in the source text, in the source language, in the source culture environment with the source readers, like our recipe in English with the English-speaking readers and the English-speaking setting, and then we compare that to the scopus that we have been given for our translation. And in doing so, during the analysis phase, we can actually anticipate translation problems that we are going to have. And we will see that certain problems will emerge that otherwise we may not have identified as problems. Having a scopus, having an aim, an intended purpose for the translation, would single out problems that might not be so otherwise. And they will be there for us, and in order to fulfill the scopus, we will be able to come up with a more holistic, comprehensive, global approach to our translation. And as a side note, it will help us perhaps to translate more in a more uniform way. So we compare the source text and its functions in the source culture and source language environment with the translation, the scopus for a translator, for a target text. And in this comparison, in this collation, we will anticipate translation problems. One of the advantages, Nord continues, of this approach to tasks in translation training is that problems can be identified in advance. And translation problems are here considered to be objective, or at least intersubjective. They are not to be equal with translation difficulties. So remember, for Christiane Nord, translation difficulties are different to translation problems, which solves the subjectivity that Roberto Mayor Asensio was complaining about. For you, this is a problem. For me, it's not. So we need to look at what a problem is. So for Christiane Nord, in this case, translation difficulties are subjective difficulties that a particular translator or trainee encounters in a translation process because of deficient linguistic, cultural, or transitional competence, or because they do not have appropriate documentation. So those, for you this is a problem, for me is not. In Christiane Nord's taxonomies or lingo, we need to refer to those as translation difficulties. This is a translation difficulty for me because I lack sufficient linguistic skills or linguistic competence or bilingual competence, or I lack cultural background, or I do not have sources of information. I can't find this term because I don't have a dictionary, I don't have the documentation sources that I need. That's a translation difficulty because it's subjective. Someone with the proper information would be in a position to solve these difficulties. She refers to translation problems as objective in the sense that they emerge from the comparison of the source text and the target text scopus that we need to fulfill. So Christiane Nord comes up with a few problem categories that I think are useful. First one, pragmatic, have to do with more contextual situations, cultural, linguistic, and specific. She refers to pragmatic describes pragmatic translation problems thus: All translation processes mediate between the source text and target text situations. So we have different situations for the source text and different situations for the target text. Pragmatic is used here in the term of context, situation of production. Pragmatic translation problems arise, Nor continues, from the differences between these situations and can be identified by checking on the extratextual factors sender, receiver, medium, time, place, and text function. Remember our first translation or the translation of the recipe. We have different pragmatic components. On the one hand, we have an individual a chef, who publishes a recipe in English in a blog or in some sort of outlet for English speakers. But then we have a new pragmatic situation, or we actually had two pragmatic situations in Spanish. On the one hand, we have a glossy magazine for a certain kind of female readers, and then on the other we had a book for children and parents, with two completely different pragmatic situations and an array of problems arising from those two different situations. One of them, for instance, for the kids, was the safety. That wasn't a problem in the pragmatic situation, the context of production of the source text. So these are the type of pragmatic problems that we have when we compare a source text and in the situation in which it was produced and the new situation in which we are going to be, or the target text that we are going to produce is going to be used by new readers. So Christiane Nord continues by saying that pragmatic translation problems are present in every translation task. And because of this, they can be generalized regardless of the languages and cultures involved in the translation of the translation process. So these are not linguistically based or culturally based. They have to do with the actual communication situation. They are thus the most important problems to deal with in the initial phases of translation training. These pragmatic translation problems are the most important for Christiane Nord. They are at the top of the hierarchy because they have to do with communicative and contextual and usage situations and contexts. Regardless of culture, regardless of the directionality of the translation process, if we were translating a Spanish recipe into English and we had a new situation, we would have these problems regardless of the language. You see, what to do with safety, what to do with measures, units of measure. This has to do, these problems derive not only from cultural components, but they have to do with different pragmatic situations. Then she continues with a description of the cultural translation problems. Translation obviously involves culture. Each culture has habits, norms, and conventions. Cultural translation problems are the result of the differences in the norms and conventions guiding verbal and non-verbal behavior in the two cultures involved. They refer to all the kinds of conventions mentioned earlier. They are present in almost every translation task, particularly in instrumental translations. However, since they depend on the particular culture or cultural groups involved, they may not have the same relevance in each case. So essentially we have translation projects in which there are cultural problems, there are cultural aspects that must be dealt with in translation. For instance, the translation of the Harry Potter novels into Arabic in a certain I can't remember exactly in which one of the books. There's a moment in which one of the female characters kisses the other a male character on the cheek. In the Arabic translations, English into Arabic, the Arabic version replaces the kiss on the cheek by shaking hands. As you can see, that's obviously a cultural component, a cultural problem. What to do with a kiss on the cheek that is not acceptable in the receiving culture for Arabic readers. Therefore, the translator decides to solve this problem by replacing the cultural unit, or the cultural component in the source text. Linguistic translation problems, of course. Translation problems can also arise from structural differences in the vocabulary, syntax, and suprasegmental features of the two languages. Languages are different, therefore we're going to be using different means to say or to convey similar messages. Some of these linguistic translation problems, I continue with the quote, are restricted to language pairs. as might be the case of cognates or false friends, with some examples. You see, one to many or one to zero equivalencies. So sometimes we have false friends of cognates in English and Spanish, or in the whatever the case may be of the language combination we are dealing with. So we have to deal with these linguistic transition problems that have to do with the languages that with the working languages. Many of these problems, nor continues, are nevertheless common to several or even all language pairs that include that one particular language. So when we translate from English into French, from English into Spanish, from English into Portuguese, some of these linguistic problems will be there. Contrastive grammar and comparative stylistics can provide valuable help in solving these problems. So this has to do with our language acumen, with our language skills. We obviously need to, as translators, need to be thoroughly familiar with both working languages so that we can keep our eyes peeled, so to speak, for the identification of these linguistic problems and solution of these linguistic problems. To continue with this hierarchy that Christiane Noor proposes in her book, Translation as a Purposeful Activity, she describes what she terms specific translation problems. Some translation problems, and I quote, are specifically bound to one particular source text, as may be the case for certain figures of speech, neologisms, new words, or puns, plays on words. Since solutions to these text-specific problems cannot be generalized and applied to similar cases, the translator must be prepared to act creatively. So we may encounter problems that have to do, that are really specific, or, as we were saying earlier on with Chesterman's reference to local strategies, there are certain problems that may have to do with a certain text as such, and therefore we need to be creative in that regard. So, as you can see, we have established a functional hierarchy from pragmatic problems to specific problems and everything in between. Christiane Noor looks at different approaches, or summarizes the approach that we can take to solve these problems, and she looks at top to bottom and bottom up approaches. In traditional translation classes, the procedure has usually been to start with the source language elements and transfer the text sentence by sentence, or more frequently, phrase by phrase, or even if possible, word by word. So that's what we normally do, right? We look at the text and we start translating by chunks. That's what we call the translation unit. That's a more technical term. But this is the traditional way of looking at or approaching a translation in a translation classroom environment. Noor continues saying, the result is a kind of draft translation, or draft one, whose quality may vary according to the translator's competence. Everyone will translate it differently to a certain degree of quality or acceptability. This text is then polished stylistically until it seems acceptable from the translator's personal point of view, or I should say also, or I may add, from the instructor's point of view, for the communicative situation it is intended for. And this is my experience as a translator trainee, mostly centered on the professor. You had to translate in a certain way to cater for the tastes and expectations of each particular translator teacher or translator instructor that we had. And it took a few, maybe a couple of translations and getting feedback from each particular translator, trainer, in order to match your translation to the expectations of that teacher. Christiane Noor, in this case, advocates a more bottom-up approach in which we go from the text surface to conventions to pragmatics. There are certain problems with the bottom-up approach. It is highly contingent on the translator's own stylistic preferences and the limitations of their linguistic and translating competence. Translating, that's another problem of the bottom-up approach, is seen as a code switching operation. We're just changing languages, right? Replacing components in language 1 with components in language 2, in which lexical and syntactic equivalences play the most important part. So we're just looking for equivalence, and they have to be purely linguistic. So what happens? Students are tempted to keep as close to the source text structures as possible. They tend to stick to the source text in this bottom-up approach, which leads to linguistic interferences and mistakes, even when translating into one's native language. We tend to import elements of the source language into the target language. At the same time, Nor continues, students often lose sight of how the text as a whole functions in its communicative situation. This leads to intuitive decisions that cannot be reasoned through intersubjectively. That is, the translator cannot really explain the decisions to the customer or reviser, nor can students and teachers really justify them to each other. So we translate why, and normally it's a musical, the musical criterion, because it sounds right, and this obviously is not really scientific. So one of the problems of this approach is that it is very difficult to come up with a translation that you can actually defend or explain away. Why did you translate this in this way? It sounded okay, or it seems to be faithful, or it seems to be the right equivalent. So this is one of the problems. We cannot come up with a justifiable or translation that we can explain. Moreover, a decision taken at a lower level often has to be revised when reaching the next level. Sometimes the translatory process is even blocked because of apparent intranslatability. So, I must say that this is the option that she really is advocating is a top-down approach. In functional translation, problems should therefore be dealt with in a top-down way. A functional translation process should start on the pragmatic level, that it's the situation where the translation, where the source text was produced, and all the components that had to do with the needs and expectations of the author and the readers, by deciding on the intended function of the translation. You see, we need to see mainly if a translation is going to be used as a translation, or if the translation is going to be, that's the documentary translation for Christian Nord, or if the translation is going to be an offer of information that seems to be original in the target language. That is, a translation that is not received as a translation as such because it works or it functions as a source text. So we need to we do well in using a top-down approach. Go to the pragmatic elements, as you remember probably, the source text analysis model that we use, also by Christiane Nord, starts by looking at the extra textual factors of the surrounding the source text. Who produced the text, what for, who were the readers, what was the place, the time of production. As you can see, all of these extra textual factors had to do with the pragmatic level, the context of production and use and reception of the source text. And this should be the starting point, because we need to match that pragmatic setting or context of production of the source text and compare it to the new pragmatic setting, the new situation or communication situation in which we are going to create a new text based on another text, but for new readers and in a new context. So this top-down approach for Nord includes a distinction that is then made between those functional elements of the source text that still have to be reproduced as such and the ones that must be adapted to the addressee's background knowledge, expectations and communicative needs, or to such factors as medium restrictions and DX's requirements. So as you can imagine, we need to tailor the information in the source text as we create a new target text that must be adapted to the new pragmatic situation. And where do we find this new pragmatic situation? In the scopus and in the translation brief. Again, a recipe produced in a certain setting for certain readers by a certain author is not or does not include the same features as a new recipe based on the previous one, written into Spanish for an audience of children and parents to be used together for cooking, for enjoyment, but with safety. we have, as we see, the new pragmatic situation for the translation or the translated text requires adaptation. This adaptation is not universal. Be careful. We don't need to adapt, change, modify in every case. This decision or this need will be apparent once we match, once we compare the pragmatic context of the source text and the pragmatic context, the scopus and translation brief, or the translation. Then we will see if we need to add, tweak, modify in order to enhance, enable communication and come up with a translation that is functionally adequate, that is, a translated text that fulfills the scopus and the translation brief. Hence, the top-down approach. Some examples of translation problems that I think might be useful. Problem 1. Imagine we have this text that we need to translate. The department faculty voted in October 2010 not to extend Williams's contract. This is about, this is just a journalistic text, that a news piece that focuses on the loss by a certain professor of her teaching assignment or teaching position in a certain university in the United States. So the department faculty voted in October 2010 not to extend Williams' contract, and after she lost an appeal to the provost, her contract was terminated at the end of June according to the lawsuit. So I've marked and highlighted the word provost as potentially a problem that we have. So if we have, if we've mentioned that we need a top-down approach, we need something else. We can't just say, why is provost a problem? We need more. We need to compare the pragmatic situation of the source text and the pragmatic situation of the target text. Where do we find the pragmatic components of the target text that we are going to produce? In the translation brief, encargo de traducción. So the encargo de traducción, we have the function is referential. The text that we're going to produce, the translation should be referential informative. It is meant to be addressed as to Spanish-speaking readers of Sunday magazine added to the newspaper El Mundo, both printed and electronic. Place of production, production, we see that it's in Spain and also online this month. And we also have again the medium, and then we also have in this case the scopus, informar a los lectores sobre posibles actitudes discriminatorias en Estados Unidos en razón de la variedad del español empleada por profesionales de la enseñanza en el marco de una investigación sobre el español en Estados Unidos. This original story has to do with the letting go of Professor Williams, who claimed later on that she had been discriminated against because she learned her Spanish in Europe and she was being discriminated against in a department in the United States. So see, in the encargo de traducción and the scopus, we have the pragmatic situation that we need to ideally match with the pragmatic information of the source text. So I would like to ask you this. I would like you to consider the following questions regarding the potential translation of this segment, especially the provost reference. To which translation problem category or categories does provost belong? Is it a problem having to do with comprehension, with reformulation, or documentation? How will you solve this problem? What alternatives do we have? What solution is the most appropriate, do you think? How do you think the brief and the scopus will help us or help you to solve this problem? So we need to translate the provost. What kind of problem do you think it will be? You can certainly classify this problem as a problem of, I don't understand it, so it's a problem of comprehension. Or how do I put this into Spanish, reformulation? Or what sources can I use, documentation, to solve this problem? Or you can also go back and see if we have a problem in this case in any of the categories in the hierarchy suggested by Christiane Nord. Stop the recording and consider these questions. Take down notes as needed. Good. So potential solutions for this problem, and as I said, these are just solutions that are just presented as suggestions. We can see this that is a problem, a lexical problem. We have a little bit of comprehension. We may or may not understand it, which might be a difficulty and not a problem. But in this case, obviously, we have a problem that has a little bit of linguistic, but also elements of pragmatic as well. So in this case, what about the sources? Do we know what it means, the source language? Do we have any sources? What alternatives do we have in the target language to translate this term once we have researched its meaning? What sources do we have for that? We could look at extralinguistic or parallel texts. We can look at, for instance, an organizational chart at the University of Pittsburgh where this problem, or this episode or events took place. And we can look at the administration levels so we can certainly understand what the source text term means, provost in the source language. If we do that, we see that we have a chancellor, which is the visible head of the hierarchy or administration organizational chart. Do we know what the chancellor does? Do we know what he or she, what the job description is? Then we can find potential equivalents if we look at administration organizational charts in Spanish universities. We find, for instance, terms like rector honorario to translate chancellor. That could be an option. We could translate it. We could keep it, chancellor. You see, we have different options. We have identified a problem. We come up with different alternatives. One would be to leave it in English in italics with an explanation in brackets. Another one would be to translate if we find an equivalent that might be useful for our readers, and understandable, intelligible for our readers. Rector honorario might be one, etc., etc. So this is one potential solution to this problem. We can come up with more context, and we can see we can learn more about the pragmatic situation, the pragmatic context of the situation, and come up with a translation that might be more acceptable by looking into the context a little bit more. Some resources that we can use include monolingual dictionaries first. It is always good advice to make sure that we understand the source text meaning by looking at monolingual sources in the source language. And then we may look at equivalent sources, again monolingual, in the target language. And we can use bilingual options like bilingual dictionaries, lingui.com, PAL Corpora, etc. We can use those to help us find potential equivalencies when we find ourselves bumping against a wall, or we cannot come up with a list of equivalents. But then we always need to fall back on monolingual sources to disambiguate these potential candidates that appear in bilingual sources. Good. Let's have a look at a problem 2. Another problem here. The department faculty voted in October, this is from the same text, 2010, not to extend Williams's contract. and after she lost an appeal to the provost, her contract was terminated at the end of June, according to the lawsuit. So we have in mind the source text. This is the source text segment, and we need to have in mind, to bear in mind what we have learned in the transition brief earlier. So more questions to consider. To which transition problem category or categories do you think department faculty belong? How would you solve this problem for starters? Come up with some sort of set of stages to solve this problem. What alternatives have you identified or generated? What solution do you think is the most appropriate? How did the brief and the Scopus help you to come up with a solution? Stop the recording and consider these questions. Take as many notes as you need as you consider the questions. Good, so if we look at this problem, we still have the lexical or linguistic level, but we can never lose sight of that pragmatic situation surrounding the production of the source text and the new production of our future text, or the text that we are producing, the target text. Do we know the meaning of department faculty? Do we have any sources in the source language and to document or to support our understanding of the source text? Dictionaries, parallel texts, etc. What alternatives do we have in the target language? What sources have we identified of this? Preferably monolingual, like parallel texts, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and so on and so forth, and perhaps using a bilingual source to bridge both and provide us with ideas. So, as you can see, and just incidentally, department faculty, in this case, obviously, we will find that when we talk about facultad, that could be a false friend, as identified by Christiane Nor earlier on, when it comes to linguistic problems. The faculty, we will learn from sources, from original sources in English, that faculty refers to the body of teachers or instructors or professors in a university or high school. Whereas if we look at facultad in Spanish sources, we will see that facultad refers to an academic unit. Facultad de Humanidades, Facultad de Letras, Facultad de Leyes, Facultad de Filosofía, what in English would be the College of Humanities, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of etc., etc. So we cannot say la Facultad del Departamento. That would be a false friend. So as you can see, we go back and forth between English source language sources and target language sources, and we triangulate and we close the circle. We are zeroing in on the correct equivalent. In this case, we will find that department faculty will have to be translated by cuerpo docente, or docentes, or profesorado. We could find certain valid alternatives. Los profesores del departamento, los docentes del departamento, el cuerpo docente del departamento, el profesorado del departamento. So we have different options, but by judiciously using sources, we'll be able to avoid an acceptable false friend, in this case, that would not be intelligible for our target readers. And if we chose that false friend or false cognate, we would not be fulfilling this corpus. So I hope this video lecture was useful. There are some selected sources that you see in the last slide, and thank you for watching this video lecture for Unit 3.